Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this special update on California tenant protections as we ongoingly respond to the coronavirus pandemic. I'm Lauren Panaccio from HealthBlaze, an organization that runs both local and national projects that unearth and address the roots of racial inequity that impact our health. I'm based here in the Bay Area in California and lead our efforts to improve housing access and affordability. I'm joined today by Madeline Howard, a senior attorney from the Western Center on Law and Poverty, an organization that advocates for housing, healthcare, and a strong safety net for low-income Californians with a focus on issues of racial and economic justice. Madeline, thanks so much for spending time with us again today.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm glad to be here. I really wish that COVID would end, but I want to help people out while we're still in this situation.
Absolutely, and we're grateful for it. In today's discussion, we're going to provide an update on how California tenants can be protected from losing their housing during the coronavirus pandemic. Again, there's been so much conversation, policies change at various levels all of the time, so we're going to do our best to give you the update at the time of recording, which is May 5th. 2020 at 3 o'clock Pacific time. And as always, we're so grateful to have Madeline here with us to help us make some sense of it. So Madeline, we're here to learn about eviction moratoriums and all their various iterations. They've been discussed at the city, county, and state level. I'm sure we've all heard a bunch of it and we're probably all confused by it. But before we go there, to start, can you remind us of the basics of the evictions process?
Yes, absolutely. There is so much confusion right now with all of the different orders and overlapping protections. So I think this is a good place to start. So one of the things that I want people to leave after hearing this talk today is just knowing that the only legal way for your landlord to evict you is by going through a court process, getting a judgment, and then having the sheriff physically remove you from your home. Obviously, no one wants to be in this situation, but the only legal way for you to be evicted is by a sheriff who has a court judgment. And so this is how I'm going to kind of lay out the different steps that you could take to get there. So the first step in any eviction is that there can be a notice that's put on your door, and the shortest one is for 3 days. That's the 3-day notice to pay rent and quit, and that's put on your door. And then if you do not pay, then the landlord generally can go to court and file a complaint saying that they want to evict the tenant from their home. At that point, the landlord has to give a copy of those court papers to the tenant, and the tenant has an opportunity to respond and say, this is the reasons that I shouldn't be evicted, this is the reasons I don't owe that rent, or the reason I couldn't pay. And then there's a trial, and a judge or a jury will make a decision. And only if the landlord wins after that court process is there a judgment that says that the landlord can evict the tenant from their home. And at that point, still, the only way for the tenant to actually be removed from their home is the sheriff with those court papers then can come and actually take the tenant out of their house. So a landlord cannot remove a tenant from their home. The police cannot remove a tenant from their home. None of those things are legal. The only legal way to evict someone is through this court process where the tenant can respond, and the only person who can evict the tenant from their home is the sheriff. So hopefully that sets us out with a good foundation for understanding the process.
Absolutely. Thanks for walking us through it. There's multiple steps to your point. So with that basic foundation laid, can you start by explaining the new protections afforded to all Californians by the state in response to the coronavirus?
Yes. So this is where we get really confused. I think the first thing that I want to say here is that there was a lot of press about the governor's order late last month at the end of March, or I guess it's 2 months ago at this point, that was titled an eviction moratorium. And that order was very confusing. It wasn't actually a moratorium. And at this point, it is totally moot. So the first step to understanding this is to ignore the governor's order. That doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't help us. Instead, what I want to talk about is a much broader and clearer protection that has been given by the Judicial Council. You probably never heard of the Judicial Council. That is the governing body that tells all of the state courts what to do. And the Judicial Council has made an emergency rule on evictions, which says that all eviction cases stop until 90 days after the end of this emergency period that we're currently in. So that is a long time from now because we're still very much in the state of emergency. And evictions are not going to restart in the courts until 90 days after the end of the emergency. So this is a really great protection for tenants. There is one exception to it, which is for cases that are necessary to public health. And it's a little bit confusing what that means. What I would think about is if a tenant is going around the building, firing a gun, or if the building has sort of burnt halfway down and it's very unsafe, those are the kind of emergency situation where the eviction case could go forward. But other than that very narrow situation, all eviction cases stop. And this is really helpful because, as I just explained, the only way for a landlord to legally evict a tenant is to go through that court process. So if the court process is stopped, then no one can be legally evicted. And what that means is that even if you can't pay your rent right now, and I know so many people are not able to pay their rent right now, you can stay in your home. And your landlord is not supposed to be making threats or trying to make you sign agreements or do other things, because the courts are paused, you cannot be evicted, and you can stay in your home right now. And again, the only person that can legally remove you from your home is a sheriff who has a court judgment.
Super helpful. And you've alluded to this, but I just want to make explicit, what can a renter do if the landlord threatens to evict you anyways?
Yeah, so this is something we've been hearing a lot about, and it sounds like there's some really bad behavior going on by landlords. So if your landlord is trying to force you to do something that you don't want to, or trying to make you sign something, trying to make you agree to leave, or trying to force you out by turning off your utilities or something like that, that is illegal. All of it is illegal, and I would encourage you to do a couple things. One of them is to contact your local legal services agency. And in most cases, those local legal services, their offices are closed, so you can't go in, but you can still contact them by phone. You can also file a complaint with the Attorney General's office. And if you just use your internet search engine and say Attorney General Consumer Complaint, the Attorney General is sort of the boss of law enforcement for the whole state, and they are very concerned about illegal evictions. So please file a complaint with them. And if your landlord is trying to force you out of your home, please also call the police. Police departments handle this in different ways. In some cities, I know the police are not super helpful, but in others, the police will come and intervene and tell the landlord they're not allowed to lock you out.
Super helpful, and so unfortunate that that's some folks' lived experience, but helpful to know that it's actually not legal, and there are protections in place to avoid that. So we talked at the state level, right? But I think we've all heard various versions of eviction moratoriums at our city or county levels as well. So can you help us understand how a person might learn about the additional protections that might be in place in their city or county?
Yeah, absolutely. So this, again, there's so much confusion because there's so many different layers of protection. So a couple of places that you can go. One is to just go to your county and city website. Most places that I've been looking at, they have sort of a banner at the top of their website where they say COVID information, and then they'll do a frequently asked questions or some other way to sort of explain what protections are in place. And some places there's both a city and a county protection, and so that kind of can work in different ways. So I would encourage people to check both. And again, your local legal aid can be a really helpful resource, as well as local groups and state groups like Housing Now and Tenants Together. They have a lot of information about local protections because it can be pretty tricky to figure out what applies to you. Tenants Together actually has a very helpful resource on their website. If you go to the resources section on Tenants Together's website, you can look up what protections are available in your city or county. So there's a lot going on. It can be challenging. If you get confused, if you get a notice or a paper from your landlord, I encourage people to call Tenants Together or your local legal aid office for some more information.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and we've heard this as a theme, even absent COVID-19, or housing policy and housing law is so complicated, and there is a network of folks that help us navigate it. So we're grateful for them at baseline, but especially now. Madeline, I think there are some patterns in what some of these local protections look like. So I'm hoping you can give us an example of what these additional local protections entail and how you can actually utilize them.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to repeat again, they do vary. So what I'm going to talk about is you should check out what's happening in your local jurisdiction. But as an example, I mean, a lot of the protections focus on people who have lost income because of COVID. So regardless of where you live, it is a good idea if you have any documentation of losing income because of COVID to hold on to that. Pay stubs before and after. If you have an employer who happened to tell you, I'm laying you off because of COVID, you should keep that letter. Thankfully, a lot of local protections recognize that many people won't have that kind of documentation, and places like Alameda County say that you can just do a sworn declaration explaining what happened to your income, even if you don't have other proof. But if you do have that proof, please keep it. And another sort of few examples of different things that places are doing. Again, Alameda County, as an example, they are giving people who lost income because of COVID 12 months to repay the rent after this is all over. And I know other places are also doing that, sort of extending the time for repayment. Alameda is also banning evictions for non-payment, and actually banning all evictions except when there's an imminent health issue. And many ordinances also specifically say that you cannot waive your protections. And what that means is even if your landlord sort of tricked you into signing something that says you would move out, or tricked you into signing something saying you'd pay back really quickly, that's not enforceable, and you still get the protections of these laws. And I also want to say here, there has been some confusion about who these apply to. I know some of the federal COVID stuff was limited to people who have legal immigration status, like some people are getting these checks in the mail. The protections that I'm talking about for tenants, it doesn't matter if you're undocumented, if you don't have legal immigration status, these apply to all tenants. So there's no exceptions like that.
That's so fortunate and helpful. I think when we think about, we say housing is health, that's always true, but especially in a world where there's a highly contagious virus that requires us to be in our homes. Needless to say, immigration status doesn't actually matter, right? That pertains to all people. Thanks for walking us through those examples and the penchant of do your research, look at your city and county websites, and ask for help from local agencies. I think that goes a long way. Let's talk about tenant protections and ensuring your home is actually safe and livable in this moment. Can tenants who can't pay their rent still request and expect for repairs that they need to have happen to make their home safe occur? Is that protection still available to them?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for asking that. Even if you're not able to pay your rent, you are still entitled to have a safe and healthy home. And if something is not working in your home, you should still ask for repairs in the same way that you always did. It's a good idea to ask in writing so that you can have proof. But absolutely, you are entitled to have repairs done even if you cannot pay your rent. And your landlord is not allowed to do things like turning off the utilities, turning off the water, doing things like that to try and force you out. That is very much against the law.
Perfect, helpful. Again, we're all spending so much time in our homes. They should be able to be healthy in them. So that's good to hear. I want to draw awareness to the time of year we're in, which is spring and summer, which is a high lease turnover time for a lot of areas, including the Bay Area. This is a tricky question, but I think an important one given where we are. What rights do tenants have while the shelter in place is still in effect and their leases are turning over? Specifically, what advice would you give a tenant who can't afford their rent, who's coming into a lease renewal with their landlord?
Yeah, that is a difficult situation. So a couple of things. I would go back to what I said at the beginning, which is, with the Judicial Council emergency rules in effect, your landlord cannot evict you. So you are safe in your home, even if you're not able to pay your rent. So that's the most important thing. Don't just leave unless you have someplace to go. Please don't do that. If you are in a situation where you know that you cannot afford it going forward, I would encourage you to try and talk with your landlord and negotiate, see if you can do something, reduce the rent. I mean, realistically, it's hard for you to find a new house, but it's also hard for a landlord to find a new tenant. They're not going to replace you if you leave. So this seems like a time that it would be mutually beneficial to do some kind of negotiation in that situation. And as always, any agreement that you come to, you want to have it in writing. But the main thing that I want people to be aware of is that they are protected from eviction, except in this narrow circumstance of a public health emergency type situation.
helpful. And of course, we're talking about some challenging circumstances, but it's just so helpful to know that the law's on our side in a lot of these instances. So we're very much in the middle of shelter in place. I think it's day 51. I candidly can't count because it'll make me go a little bit bananas. Just me at least. but let's imagine a world where shelter in place is lifted, which I think we all hope is in our future. But let's look at that with a lens of rent being due and landlords paying mortgages and all of that. Can you help us understand when will rent be due, and if so, how it might work?
Yeah, I really wish that I had a better answer for this at this moment. This is such a tricky issue. As I mentioned, some local jurisdictions have laws now that say that tenants will have an extended period of time to pay back rent, which is helpful. But it's hard because it's not like people are suddenly going to have an increased income and be able to make up all this time that they weren't able to work. So right now, it depends on where you live. But there are many places that don't have local protections or they aren't very strong. And so many people, including myself and my colleagues in Sacramento, are working really hard to ensure that when we do come out of this, there are good tenant protections. Some of the solutions that have been proposed are that you just will not be able to evict someone for non-payment of rent during this time ever, and that money, although it would still be owed, it would be owed as a regular money judgment, so not the basis for an eviction. There's also a lot of work going on to try and find money to help fill this hole, because we know that landlords have to pay their mortgages, and some of that will probably be forgiven through various protections, but some of it won't. So a lot of people are working on this, and it's just not figured out yet. I think one of the tricky things is we don't know how long this is going to last. It obviously gets harder the longer we're in this situation. But I think the things to do right now are to keep documentation if you've lost income because of COVID, and we're working on it. Try to learn what your local protections are, because in some places you will have more time, and we're trying to make it a better situation at the state level. And maybe we'll be talking again in a few months and I'll have something more helpful to say on this.
Well, as always, Madeline, we're so grateful for having you here to help us make sense of it. It is a challenging situation. It's confusing at baseline, but we know a little bit more thanks to you. Thanks to you and again, the many other wonderful legal allies and housing counseling services that are helping us all make sense of this moment in time. We hope that this emergency recording was helpful. As always, if folks have comments, we're here for you. Please email us, Bali, B-A-L-I, @healthleadsusa.org. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay engaged. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.